Have you ever walked into your own house and realized, in one quiet second, that the person you trusted most had already rehearsed your destruction? Because that question didn't just cross my mind that day, it carved itself into me, and even now, years later, it sits heavy in my chest like a stone I can't quite shake, because I was 57 years old when it happened, not young, not impulsive, not reckless, not some clueless bloke stumbling through life, but a man who had worked decades, paid bills on time, raised kids, buried parents, survived layoffs, and believed that surprises were mostly behind him, the kind of man who thought marriage was something you graduate into, not something that can still ambush you when your hair's gone gray and your back complains every morning. And I truly believed I understood loyalty. I believed I understood my wife. I believed that after 30 years together there were no scripts left to memorize, no performances left to perfect, just honesty, routine, and the quiet understanding of two people who had already weathered the worst. And that belief was so strong that afternoon felt ordinary, almost boring, the kind of day that doesn't announce itself as the moment everything changes, because I left work early for no dramatic reason at all, no fight, no emergency, no secret plan, just a meeting that wrapped up quicker than expected and a stretch of road home that felt strangely open, like the universe had cleared its throat and stepped aside. And I remember thinking how rare it felt to drive home while the sun was still high, how the traffic lights seemed kinder, how my shoulders felt lighter than usual, and on a whim, one of those harmless impulses you don't question at my age, I pulled over at a small florist I'd driven past 1,000 times without stopping, a place with a faded sign and buckets of flowers sitting out front, and I went in and bought a simple bouquet. Nothing dramatic, no roses screaming apology or desperation, just white and yellow flowers, clean and honest, the kind you buy when you still believe love doesn't need an excuse. And as I walked back to my car holding them, I remember feeling almost sheepish, like a teenager doing something sentimental for the first time, and I laughed quietly at myself, thinking she'd probably tease me for it, ask what I'd done wrong, because that was our rhythm, gentle jokes, comfortable sarcasm, the kind that comes from years of shared life. And when I pulled into our driveway, I didn't rush inside. I sat there for a moment with the engine ticking and the steering wheel warm under my palms, looking at the house we'd bought together, painted together, fixed together, a house that held birthdays, arguments, late-night talks, and ordinary mornings. And I smiled, genuinely smiled, thinking how surprised she'd be, because after 30 years surprises were rare, and that alone should have warned me. But I didn't hear it yet. I picked up the flowers, opened the door quietly, not sneaky, not careful, just normal quiet, the way you do when you assume you're walking into safety. And that's when I heard her voice, not talking to someone, not laughing, not arguing, not on the phone, but practicing, rehearsing, repeating, and my body froze before my mind caught up, because there's something deeply unsettling about hearing someone you love speak without an audience, shaping their words like clay. And I stood there as she faced the hallway mirror. Our mirror, the one we chose together after the kitchen remodel because she liked how it made the space feel brighter, and I watched her dab at her eyes with a tissue, lower it, study her reflection, tilt her head, shake it slowly like she was disappointed in herself, like she was broken-hearted, then straighten her shoulders and say the same sentence again with the same careful pause and the same practiced crack in her voice. I swear, I never meant for it to happen. And she said it again, and again, adjusting her tone slightly each time, softer here, firmer there, like she was testing which version sounded most believable. And I didn't move, didn't breathe loud, didn't drop the flowers, because my hands had gone numb and my feet felt rooted to the floor. And I stood there watching the woman I had built my life with rehearse her lies like lines in a play. And then she picked up her phone and began deleting messages, not in a panic, not with shaking hands, but calmly, methodically. Scrolling, pausing, deleting, scrolling again, the way someone does when they know exactly what they're removing and why, the way someone does when this isn't their first time cleaning up a story. And she stopped occasionally to glance at herself in the mirror, to practice another line, to smooth her face, to wipe her eyes, like she was preparing for an audience that hadn't arrived yet. And in that moment something inside me shifted, because I realized she wasn't reacting to a mistake. She wasn't scrambling after being caught. She was preparing for exposure, planning ahead, shaping the narrative before anyone else had a chance to ask questions. And the strangest part was I wasn't shocked, I wasn't angry yet, I wasn't even heartbroken in the way you'd expect. What I felt was clarity, sharp and cold and undeniable, the kind of clarity that comes when your gut finally lines up with the facts you've been quietly collecting, because for months something had been off, the late nights that didn't make sense, the stories that changed slightly each time, the phone always face down, the sudden new passwords, the way she'd get defensive over nothing, and I hadn't confronted her, hadn't accused her, because at my age you learn that explosions don't reveal truth, they just scatter it. So instead I watched, I listened, I noticed patterns, I trusted my instincts, and I backed everything up, screenshots, timelines, small details that didn't mean much on their own but formed a picture. When laid out together, and she didn't know that, she thought she was ahead of the story, she thought she was directing it, and as I stood there holding those flowers, watching her rehearse, I understood that the moment I confronted her would be the moment she unleashed that performance on me, tears included. So I did the one thing she didn't expect. I stepped back outside quietly, closed the door the same way I'd opened it, sat back in my car, and let the silence settle, the flowers resting on the passenger seat between us like a bad joke. And I didn't cry, didn't shout, didn't pound the steering wheel. I just sat there and thought, all right then, let her perform, because what she didn't know, what she couldn't see in that mirror, was that I already had the full script, and I was about to let her play her role perfectly, all the way to the end. Before I knew what she was rehearsing in that mirror, before I understood that my life had already split into a before and an after, I was a man who believed he had earned his peace, and that belief didn't come from arrogance but from years of doing things the hard, steady way, because I grew up in a house where nothing came easy and nothing was promised, where my father worked until his hands cracked and my mother stretched meals without ever complaining. So by the time I met my wife, I already believed that love wasn't fireworks or loud declarations. It was showing up, again and again, even when you were tired, even when you were bored, even when you felt unappreciated. And I met her in my mid-20s, back when my hair was thick and my optimism was louder than my doubts. We met through mutual friends at a backyard cookout. Nothing cinematic, just paper plates, cheap beer, and a radio playing in the background. And she laughed at something I said, not the polite laugh people give out of kindness, but a full laugh, the kind that pulls you in. And I remember thinking she felt safe, not exciting in a reckless way, but steady, like someone you could build with. And that's what we did. We built, slowly and imperfectly. We struggled early, counting dollars at the grocery store, choosing which bills could wait, arguing over stupid things like paint colors and weekend plans, learning how to fight without tearing each other apart, learning when to speak and when to shut up. And when the kids came, everything else faded into the background because suddenly there were schedules, school lunches, late-night fevers, scraped knees, parent-teacher meetings, and those years blur together now. But at the time they felt full, exhausting, meaningful, and we were proud of ourselves, proud of surviving things that broke other couples, proud that we stayed when leaving would have been easier. And as the years passed, love changed shape. It stopped being about passion and became about reliability, about knowing who would pick up the phone, who would handle the crisis, who would sit beside you in silence when words didn't help. And I took comfort in that, because I believed that aging together meant safety, meant you'd already seen each other at your worst, already forgiven what mattered, already learned each other's flaws so well they stopped feeling dangerous, and trust became routine, not something you questioned daily but something you assumed the way you assumed the sun will rise. And maybe that was my mistake, because routine has a way of dulling your senses, and comfort can hide cracks better than chaos ever could. And there were signs, small ones at first, moments that didn't quite fit, but I brushed them aside because love felt earned, because I told myself we'd already proven ourselves, because after 30 years you don't expect deception, you expect honesty even when it hurts. And I believed in quiet loyalty, the kind no one applauds, the kind that doesn't make stories worth telling. And I lived that loyalty without keeping score, without checking phones, without asking questions I didn't want the answers to, because I trusted the life we'd built more than the doubts whispering at the edges of my mind. And I thought that was maturity, I thought that was wisdom, I thought that was what being a good husband looked like. And maybe it was, once, but somewhere along the way, while I was busy believing we were solid, something underneath us was shifting, and I didn't see it because I wasn't looking for it, because I believed that at my age, after all we'd survived, betrayal was something that happened to other people, to younger couples, to reckless hearts, not to a man who thought he was finally standing on steady ground. The slow shift didn't arrive like a storm, it came like a draft through a house you've lived in too long to notice right away, subtle enough that you tell yourself it's nothing, that you're imagining it, that you're just tired or getting older, because that's how it started for me, with small things that felt too petty to name, let alone accuse. Like the way she'd pause a half-second too long before answering simple questions, or how her stories would stay mostly the same but the details would quietly rearrange themselves depending on the day, or how her phone, once left on counters and tables without a thought, suddenly became something she carried everywhere like a second pulse, always face down, always locked, always close. And at first I explained it away because after 30 years you learn to make excuses for the person you love. You learn to protect the story you've been telling yourself. And I told myself she was stressed. That time changes people, that marriage naturally grows quieter and more distant, that emotional closeness ebbs and flows, especially at our age when kids are grown and silence fills rooms you once navigated by noise. But the patterns didn't stop, they repeated, and repetition is what makes doubt harder to ignore, because once is coincidence and twice is curiosity, but 3 times starts to feel like a message you're refusing to read. And I noticed how she'd become defensive over things that never used to matter, questions that were harmless suddenly felt like accusations to her, and when I'd point out something she'd said differently before, she'd smile and tell me I was remembering it wrong, lightly at first, joking even, like it was nothing. But the more it happened, the more that smile started to feel sharp around the edges, and I'd walk away from those conversations with a strange sensation, like my footing had shifted, like I'd been gently nudged off balance without realizing it. And that's when the gaslighting began, not dramatic, not obvious, just enough to make me doubt my own memory, my own instincts, my own sense of timing. And I hated that feeling more than anything because I'd always trusted my judgment. I'd built a life on it, and suddenly I found myself replaying conversations in my head, wondering if I'd misheard, misremembered, misunderstood. And that internal conflict was exhausting because part of me wanted to confront her, wanted to put everything on the table and demand clarity, while another part, the older part, the wiser part shaped by decades of watching people react under pressure, told me that confrontation without proof only teaches liars how to lie better. And so I chose observation over explosion, not because I was weak, but because I was patient, because I understood that truth reveals itself when you give it room. And I began to pay attention in ways I never had before, not obsessively, not like a man hunting for betrayal, but like someone finally listening to the rhythm of his own house, noticing how often she stepped outside to take calls, how her tone changed when certain names came up, how her schedule developed gaps that couldn't be explained by errands or traffic. And I didn't accuse, I didn't interrogate, I asked neutral questions and watched how she answered them, how quickly she filled silence, how often she over-explained things that didn't need explanation. And the realization crept in slowly that I was no longer part of her inner world, that she was editing herself around me. And that knowledge hurt in a quiet, deep way, because distance doesn't announce itself, it just grows until you notice you're speaking different emotional languages. And it was during this time that I made the decision that would later save my sanity, the decision to document instead of explode, because at 57 I knew anger burns hot but fast, while evidence lasts. And so I started backing things up, not out of revenge, not with any grand plan in mind, but out of self-preservation, because I needed something solid to hold on to when my reality felt like it was being gently rearranged without my consent. And the first backups felt almost ridiculous, screenshots of messages that felt innocent on their own, timestamps, calendar notes, small inconsistencies I would have laughed off years earlier. But as weeks turned into months, those pieces began forming patterns. And patterns tell stories whether you want them to or not. And with every new realization came a strange mix of dread and relief. Dread because something I loved was clearly unraveling. Relief because I finally understood that I wasn't imagining things, that my instincts hadn't failed me, that the confusion I'd been carrying wasn't a flaw in me but a reaction to something real. And still I said nothing, because age had taught me that silence, when chosen deliberately, is not surrender, it's strategy. And I watched, and I waited, and I learned more about the woman I thought I knew in those quiet months than I had in years. Because people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they're unseen. And by the time I made that first full backup, by the time I realized I was no longer guessing but confirming, I understood that whatever was coming next would change everything, and that the man I was becoming in that moment was no longer just a husband trying to save a marriage, but a man preparing to protect himself from a truth that was already unfolding. There comes a moment when doubt stops circling quietly in your head and lands square in your chest, heavy and undeniable. And for me that moment didn't arrive with shouting or discovery or some dramatic confrontation. It arrived with clarity, slow and brutal, when the last pieces finally slid into place and the truth stopped whispering and started speaking in a voice I could no longer ignore. Because one night, long after she'd gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table with the house quiet around me and opened the backups I'd been collecting, not with the excitement of a man looking to be proven right, but with the dread of someone who already knew what he was about to see. And that's when the timelines aligned, not just states and messages but behaviors and absences and explanations that no longer stood on their own but leaned into each other like a structure revealing its shape. And suddenly the late nights matched the gaps in her stories, the sudden errands lined up with the same recurring numbers, the emotional distance matched moments when her attention had clearly been elsewhere, and it wasn't one message or one moment that broke me. It was the accumulation, the realization that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a phase or a moment of weakness. It was a pattern sustained over time, carefully managed, deliberately hidden, and in that quiet kitchen I felt something inside me collapse without making a sound, because this was the woman who had stood beside me at funerals, who had celebrated promotions, who had promised partnership through sickness and age, and now the evidence told a different story, one she had been living parallel to our marriage. And the strange thing was I didn't feel the explosive anger people talk about. I felt restraint, a tightness in my chest that held everything in, because I knew that if I let myself react emotionally I would lose control of the one thing that still belonged entirely to me, my response. And so I sat there for hours, rereading, cross-checking, confirming, not because I wanted to torture myself but because I needed certainty, because once you confront someone with this kind of truth you don't get to walk it back, and I needed to know that what I was seeing was real. And when the certainty finally settled, it was suffocating, because knowing something devastating while pretending not to know it is its own kind of torment. And the days that followed were some of the hardest of my life, because I had to wake up next to her, eat meals with her, listen to her talk about her day, respond to her questions, all while carrying the full weight of what I now knew. And that weight followed me everywhere, to work, to the grocery store, into the shower, into bed, and sleep became something distant and unreliable, because every time I closed my eyes my mind replayed conversations with new meaning, moments that now felt staged, laughter that now felt borrowed, and I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the years of my life rearrange themselves in my memory, questioning how long this had really been going on, questioning which moments were real and which were already compromised. And still I said nothing, because restraint had become my shield, because I understood that once I spoke, everything would accelerate, and I wasn't ready to let her know how much I already knew, because I could see now how easily she rewrote reality when challenged, how confidently she denied and deflected. And I knew that confronting her without revealing my full hand would only teach her to destroy what evidence remained. And so I stayed silent and strategic, not cold, not cruel, just deliberate, observing her more carefully than ever, noticing how relaxed she was in her deception, how easily she shifted tones depending on the audience, how naturally the lies flowed when she believed they were safe. And that realization was perhaps the most painful of all, because it meant this wasn't eating her alive the way it was eating me. It meant she had already justified it to herself, already rehearsed the version of events she planned to present when the time came, and I could feel the loneliness of that knowledge settling in my bones, because betrayal isn't just about what someone does, it's about realizing you're carrying a truth alone while the person who owes you honesty sleeps peacefully beside you. And yet, through the exhaustion and the anger I refused to let myself unravel, because I knew that patience was my only advantage, because truth, when released too early, gets tangled in emotion, but truth, when released at the right moment, stands on its own. And so I waited, night after sleepless night, holding myself together with discipline and routine, knowing that the man I had been before this knowledge was gone, replaced by someone quieter, sharper, and more aware, someone who understood that justice doesn't always come from confrontation, sometimes it comes from timing. And as the days passed and my silence remained unbroken, I knew one thing with certainty: the betrayal was confirmed, irreversible, and whatever came next would not be shaped by anger, but by clarity. The performance began exactly the way I had watched her rehearse it, almost down to the breath, and what struck me first wasn't the lie itself but how comfortable she was delivering it, how natural it sounded rolling off her tongue, as if she'd been carrying it around for weeks waiting for the right stage. And that stage arrived when she finally decided the timing was safe, when she gathered friends first under the excuse of concern and confusion, sharing just enough to shape their expectations, painting herself as overwhelmed and misunderstood, carefully choosing words that made her sound fragile without appearing guilty. And I watched all of this quietly from the edges, listening as people nodded sympathetically, as heads tilted and voices softened, because people want a story they can digest easily, one with a clear victim and a clear explanation, and she gave them exactly that. Then came family, both hers and mine, where she leaned harder into emotion, where tears appeared right on cue, where pauses were perfectly placed to let others fill in the gaps with their own assumptions. And I saw how quickly narratives take hold when no one interrupts them, how fast people decide who deserves comfort and who deserves scrutiny, and when they looked at me, they didn't see a man in pain, they saw a man being quiet, and quiet unsettles people because they don't know what to do with it, and some mistook my silence for guilt, others for indifference, but none of them understood it was restraint, deliberate and disciplined, because I had learned that anger makes liars look brave and truth look defensive, and I wasn't about to give her that advantage, so I stayed calm. I answered questions simply when asked, never adding more than necessary, never contradicting her publicly, never correcting details even when I knew they were wrong, and that unnerved people more than shouting ever could, because silence creates space, and in that space people start to listen more closely, they start noticing the inconsistencies on their own, they start comparing stories without being prompted, and I could see it happening slowly in real time. The way a friend would glance sideways after one of her explanations lingered too long, the way a family member would ask the same question twice on different days and get slightly different answers, and each time I remained steady, grounded, unreactive, and that steadiness became its own counter-narrative, because while she was emotional and expressive and visibly trying to manage perception, I was simply present, not defensive, not hostile, just there, and that contrast made people uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite explain, because society expects betrayal to be loud, expects confrontation to be messy, expects the wronged person to fall apart, and when that doesn't happen, when the person who should be raging instead listens quietly and remembers everything, it disrupts the script everyone is used to, and I watched as her control of the narrative slowly became more work for her, as she had to keep adjusting details, keep reassuring people, keep checking reactions, while I did nothing but observe, and some nights I could feel the weight of it pressing on my chest, the urge to speak rising like a tide, but I reminded myself that every time she spoke, she revealed more than she intended, and every time I stayed silent, I preserved the power I would need later, and there was a moment, subtle but unmistakable, when the room shifted, when one of her friends stopped nodding automatically, when a family member asked a question that wasn't on her script, and I saw the flicker of irritation flash across her face before she caught it, before she smoothed it out and smiled again, and that's when I knew the performance, as polished as it was, couldn't sustain itself forever, because lies require constant maintenance, while truth, once spoken, stands on its own, and by letting her lie without interruption, by refusing to compete with her version of events, I allowed her to exhaust herself holding it together, and people sensed that imbalance even if they couldn't articulate it, because restraint unnerves people more than anger, it forces them to think instead of react, and while she worked tirelessly to control how she was seen, I focused on controlling only myself, trusting that time and consistency would do what confrontation could not, and by the end of those early days, though no one had openly challenged her yet, I could feel the ground shifting beneath the performance, because silence, when backed by truth, has a way of making noise all on its own. The reveal didn't happen in a courtroom or across a dinner table with raised voices and slammed hands, it happened quietly, deliberately, almost gently, because by the time I decided to release what I knew, I understood something most people never do in moments like this, that truth doesn't need volume to be devastating, it needs timing, and the timing came on an ordinary evening when everyone thought the story had already settled into place, when friends believed they understood what was happening and family thought the worst had already been processed, and I asked for nothing dramatic, just a moment, just the chance to clarify a few things, and the room shifted the second I spoke because people weren't used to hearing from me, not like that, not calmly, not steadily, and I didn't accuse her, didn't insult her, didn't even look at her at first. I simply laid things out the way a man does when he's done carrying confusion, starting with timelines, not emotional ones but factual ones, dates, times, overlaps that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. And I watched as heads leaned forward, as brows furrowed, as people realized they were being asked to listen differently now, and then I introduced the backups, calmly explaining that when patterns repeat, responsible adults pay attention, and I showed them messages, not selectively, not edited, but complete, placed next to calendars and explanations they'd already heard from her, and the effect was immediate and irreversible, because confidence collapses faster than anger ever could, and I saw it in her face as the room went quiet, as the sympathetic murmurs stopped, as no one rushed to comfort her anymore, because evidence changes gravity, it pulls attention toward itself whether people wanted to or not, and I continued, not faster, not slower, just steady, pointing out patterns that were impossible to explain away, not once raising my voice, not once using dramatic language, because drama would have distracted from what was already doing the work for me, and the silence grew heavier with every comparison, every mismatch, every explanation that no longer fit, and I could see people recalibrating in real time, mentally replaying conversations they'd had with her, re-examining moments they'd accepted without question, and that's when her performance finally collapsed, not with tears this time, not with rehearsed lines, but with stillness, because when lies run out of room, they don't explode. They freeze, and she tried once to interrupt, to reframe, to soften what was being seen, but the room no longer belonged to her, and that was the moment I understood the full power of restraint, because I hadn't taken anything from her, I had simply stopped protecting the illusion she'd been standing on, and without that protection, there was nothing left to hold her story up, and people didn't turn on her loudly, they didn't shout or accuse, they just went quiet, and silence is far more dangerous to a performance than confrontation, because silence means people are thinking, and I finished by saying very little, just enough to make it clear that I wasn't asking anyone to choose sides, that I wasn't seeking revenge or validation, that I was simply done carrying a truth alone, and when I finally looked at her, really looked at her, I didn't feel triumph, I felt finality, because the woman who had rehearsed so carefully hadn't prepared for one thing, the calm release of everything at once, and as the room slowly filled with awkward movement and people found excuses to leave, I knew the story had rewritten itself without me ever having to raise my voice, because evidence, when allowed to speak uninterrupted, has a way of ending performances permanently. The fall didn't hit like a storm, it arrived in whispers and pauses, in empty chairs and unanswered calls, in subtle shifts that you could almost convince yourself were coincidence if you weren't paying attention, and I watched it all unfold with a strange mixture of detachment and sorrow because the consequences were not violent, they were quiet but no less absolute, and it was as if the world itself had paused to recalibrate after the reveal, adjusting itself to the weight of truth that I had finally allowed to exist in full view, and I saw it first in friends, those who had once leaned on her words with unquestioning faith, suddenly hesitating before speaking, their smiles faltering in mid-conversation, their conversations with me changing tone, becoming softer, more careful, more inquisitive, as though they were measuring every word, every glance, searching for a hint that what they were witnessing wasn't real, and slowly, over the days and weeks, some of them withdrew entirely. Not because I had attacked, not because I had denounced her publicly, not because I had gossiped or forced judgment, but because truth has a gravity all its own, and people sense when a story's foundation has shifted, when the pillars they've leaned on for years are suddenly unstable, and they instinctively distance themselves until the dust settles, until they can reconcile what they had believed with what they now know. And family followed a similar rhythm, those who once sat comfortably around dinner tables and family gatherings, laughing at jokes I now recognized as carefully crafted performances, began to choose absence over participation, sending messages that felt perfunctory, visits that felt obligatory, and I realized in those moments how fragile social bonds are when the illusions we live by crumble quietly under their own weight, and while her isolation grew, a quiet, creeping solitude that she tried to disguise with forced energy and social appearances, I remained present in my life, in our home, in my routine, watching without cruelty, because the goal had never been to humiliate or punish her in the way the world imagines revenge. It was simply to allow reality to reassert itself, and observing that process, the way silence can speak louder than confrontation, taught me more about people than I had ever wanted to know, about the ease with which loyalty bends when faced with undeniable proof, about how quickly confidence evaporates when the foundation of a narrative shifts, and about the subtle, almost imperceptible ways people distance themselves from those who no longer fit the story they had committed to. And in the quiet of the mornings, sitting alone with my coffee while she left for errands or spent hours on calls that no longer seemed private, I felt a clarity I had never experienced before, a serenity born not from victory but from understanding, because watching the consequences arrive quietly allowed me to see the truth of my own life, the patterns that had been hidden in plain sight, the energy and attention we spend performing to maintain appearances, and the freedom that comes when those performances are no longer required. And while I saw her struggle to maintain her place in social circles that had once validated her, fumbling to patch over inconsistencies that were now glaringly obvious, I never gnashed my teeth, never raised my voice, never sought to exploit her faltering steps, because the fall itself, observed without interference, has a way of teaching lessons more enduring than any punishment could. And in the weeks that followed, I watched her isolation grow, subtle at first, friends declining invites with polite excuses, family offering less than before, leaving her with small pockets of attention that only underscored the absence of the larger network she had relied on. And yet, in that quiet, I felt no triumph, only relief that clarity had replaced confusion, that the truth, finally visible to all who were willing to see it, had removed the veil under which deception thrived for so long, and I realized that in patience, in restraint, in allowing things to unfold without interference, I had discovered a new strength within myself, a calm center that did not need to punish to assert power, and I observed all this with careful attention, noting the patterns of withdrawal, the hesitant words, the nervous laughter that had once been easy, and the uncomfortable glances she could no longer command, and in doing so, I found a kind of justice that required nothing from me, only the measured decision to remain steady, to allow truth to do the work, and as the days turned into weeks, and the quiet weight of consequence settled around her like a fog that could not be swept away, I understood more deeply than I ever had before that real power lies not in shouts or threats or dramatic displays, but in the patient, deliberate act of standing calmly while the world rearranges itself around reality, and that observation without cruelty, that patience without malice, is the most effective form of accountability there is, and in that quiet, I felt both grief and release, because while relationships fractured and her isolation deepened, I reclaimed a clarity and presence that had been obscured by deception for years, and watching the consequences arrive quietly, without intervention, without spectacle, without the need to prove my own righteousness, revealed to me a profound truth, that the weight of reality, once unleashed, does its work perfectly, and that sometimes the best revenge, the most complete justice, is to let the truth fall where it must while you remain steady, intact, and unshaken in the center of your own life, quietly bearing witness to the unraveling of falsehoods while preserving your own dignity and clarity. Walking away clean was not a single moment, nor a dramatic exit punctuated by slammed doors or loud confrontations. It was the slow, deliberate unraveling of a life entangled in deception, the methodical release of a chapter one had once believed would never end, and by the time I made that step, at 57, I had carried the weight of truth long enough to understand the precise difference between what I could control and what I could not, and that understanding became my anchor through months of observation, reflection, and quiet preparation, because patience is learned through hardship, through watching patterns repeat, through seeing betrayal unfold in slow motion, and I realized that the most profound strength is born not from force, but from restraint, from the decision to act only when the moment aligns with clarity, and so I began the process of walking away without spectacle, without drama, without the need to make anyone feel the impact of my knowledge, because true power requires no audience, and the first step was legal certainty, ensuring that every message, every calendar entry, every incongruity, every proof of deception was documented, backed up, and organized, not for vengeance, but for my own protection, because knowing that I had absolute clarity over the timeline of her lies, the patterns she had followed, the evidence she had worked to obscure, gave me a sense of calm and authority that no shouting could replicate, and that calm was crucial. Because anger clouds judgment, desperation invites error, and I had no intention of letting her manipulation extend beyond the moment I controlled, so I maintained my composure, even as I watched her world begin to subtly crumble under the weight of the truths I had quietly preserved, and that preservation was itself a lesson in discipline, in self-respect, in dignity, because I had learned that letting go without chaos, releasing control without surrendering it, walking away without performing the drama that others might expect, is the ultimate reclamation of one's life, and after months of silent observation, I found the emotional closure that so many seek in confrontation in the quiet reflection of nights spent alone, letting the grief settle without lashing out, feeling the sting of betrayal without reacting destructively, allowing myself to mourn not only what was lost, but what was built under false pretenses, yet balancing that with the relief of finally knowing the full story. The full weight of truth, which freed me from the uncertainty that had shadowed every interaction, every conversation, every glance, and from that relief grew a deeper awareness, that dignity does not require acknowledgement, that self-respect is cultivated internally, and that the quiet reclamation of one's life after deception is infinitely more powerful than any public vindication. And I moved through social spaces with care, letting the truth I carried speak for itself, never needing to explain, to argue, to force perception, because I understood that silence, when paired with evidence and calm certainty, unsettles deception far more effectively than accusation ever could, and I watched as friends recalibrated, as family reconsidered their assumptions, as her careful performances lost their power, not because I attacked, but because I no longer participated in the illusion she had created. And with every interaction, every subtle adjustment in routine, every measured response, I reinforced the principle that my life, my choices, my dignity, were mine alone, not subject to manipulation, not dependent on approval, and that realization allowed me to rebuild my days with intentionality, mornings without tension, afternoons without pretense, evenings without unease, a life lived with clarity, awareness, and deliberate focus, while her world, by contrast, shifted under the undeniable weight of exposure, and I never gloated, I never manipulated, I simply existed in the reality I had reclaimed, demonstrating that patience and clarity are more potent than any scream, more enduring than any act of vengeance, and in doing so, I understood that walking away clean is both the ultimate act of survival and a profound declaration of personal sovereignty, because it communicates, without words, that control, dignity, and peace are more powerful than anger, more enduring than revenge, and more rewarding than any public vindication. And as I finally closed the door on the chapters of deceit and manipulation she had authored, I stepped forward with an unshakable sense of freedom, a clarity untainted by chaos, and the rare, profound joy of a man who had navigated betrayal, observed its consequences quietly, allowed the truth to run its course, and emerged whole, intact, and fully sovereign over the narrative of his own life, carrying nothing but integrity, self-respect, and the quiet, enduring power of walking away clean. At 57, after decades spent building a life with someone I thought I knew, after years of shared mornings, late-night talks, the raising of children, the quiet victories and small defeats that stitch themselves into the fabric of a long marriage, I learned, finally, that silence carries more power than any words, more weight than any dramatic outburst, because silence allows reflection, observation, and clarity to take root in a way that anger and accusation cannot, and in that silence, I found lessons that reshaped my understanding of love, trust, and self-worth, not as abstract ideas but as living, breathing realities that had been obscured by deception and the habitual routines of a life spent believing appearances were truth. And I thought about love, the kind of enduring, patient, committed love that carries through decades, and I realized it is not merely about affection or companionship but about presence, about knowing someone deeply enough to see when their behavior diverges from their words, about feeling the subtle shifts in tone and rhythm that signal change. And yet, even in that love, betrayal can strike, quietly, insidiously, altering what you thought was solid ground beneath your feet. And I reflected on trust, how fragile it is, how easily it can be eroded by repetition, by the rewriting of events, by the deliberate manipulation of perception. And I understood that trust, once broken, does not always need dramatic confrontation to assert itself. Sometimes it is restored, sometimes it is preserved, not through reconciliation, but through the deliberate choice to step away, to claim your own life, to maintain your own integrity while others falter under the weight of their actions. And in that step away, I discovered self-worth in its most authentic form, not measured by recognition from the deceiver or by public validation, but by the unshakable knowledge that you have acted with discipline, patience, and moral clarity, that you have allowed truth to speak for itself, and that your life, at long last, is governed by your own principles rather than the chaos or manipulation of someone else. And in observing all of this quietly, I saw how revenge, often imagined as loud and destructive, can instead be an act of precision, patience, and calm, how its most effective form is not in shouts or public humiliation but in allowing the evidence of deception to unfold naturally, to let lies collapse under their own weight, and to step away intact while the world quietly rearranges itself around reality. And I realized that truth is strongest when released calmly, without embellishment, without spectacle, because the human mind, confronted with undeniable facts, cannot ignore them, cannot recast them, cannot fully shield itself from what is plainly visible. And in that understanding, I saw that walking away is not surrender, it is mastery, the ultimate declaration of independence, and the cleanest ending one can craft from the ruins of a life once shared, because it preserves dignity, protects the soul, and asserts, in silence, that you are whole, that you are unbroken, that you need nothing from anyone who cannot meet you in honesty. And in reflecting on decades of marriage, betrayal, deception, and the deliberate, measured response that followed, I found a deep, almost meditative clarity, a peace that does not come from vindication but from knowing that you have done everything possible to act rightly, to allow consequences to arrive without forcing them, to observe without cruelty, to maintain moral and emotional composure even as the world shifted around you. And in that reflection, I understood something fundamental about aging, about being 57 and having lived long enough to see patterns, to see lies, to see intentions, to know the difference between appearances and reality, and to realize that life is less about controlling others than it is about controlling yourself, about mastering Your own responses, about allowing wisdom and patience to guide your actions where emotion would have once dictated them, and I thought about the freedom that comes from accepting that you cannot rewrite someone else's story, that you cannot force truth into their perception, but you can release it in a way that it speaks for itself, and you can walk away with your hands clean, your conscience clear, and your dignity intact, and in that freedom, I understood that peace is a more potent reward than revenge, that calmness is a more enduring form of power than rage, that walking away with integrity is a far more profound achievement than any act of public retribution could ever be. And as I sat quietly in the rooms that had once been filled with orchestrated performances, rehearsed lies, and manipulated perceptions, I felt the weight of decades lift from my shoulders, not instantly, not in a moment of triumph, but gradually, as the patterns of my own life resumed their rightful course. The rhythm of my daily routines reclaiming a natural balance, the mornings, afternoons, and evenings unfolding without tension, without pretense, without the constant recalculation of behaviors, and I allowed myself to feel sorrow for what had been lost, yes, but also relief, immense relief, for the clarity and sovereignty I had earned through restraint, through patience, through deliberate observation, and I understood finally that true strength does not announce itself, does not demand recognition, does not require spectacle, but exists quietly, persistently, in the choices you make to act with integrity, to preserve yourself, and to leave behind what cannot serve you. And in that profound realization, I found the deepest lesson that silence could teach me at 57, that walking away, calmly, with self-respect, with clarity, and with dignity intact, is the ultimate expression of justice, of power, and of love for oneself, and that sometimes the cleanest ending, the most complete resolution, is not measured in public applause or dramatic confrontations but in the quiet knowledge that you have done everything right by your own standards, allowed the truth to reveal itself naturally, and emerged unbroken, sovereign over your own life, finally free from the manipulation, deception, and chaos that had once threatened to define you. And as I looked forward into the years ahead, I carried with me this understanding as a shield and a compass, knowing that no matter what unfolds, no performance, no lie, no orchestrated deception can diminish the power of a life lived with integrity, patience, and the calm courage to step away, because silence, when fully embraced and deliberately chosen, is not emptiness but the loudest proclamation of truth, strength, and freedom a man can ever achieve. If there is one thing I have learned in 57 years of living, loving, and surviving betrayal, it is that life rarely delivers lessons wrapped in comfort, and the most profound truths often arrive dressed in quiet suffering and observation rather than in the fireworks of dramatic revelation, because what people mistake for justice is usually noise, a cacophony of accusation and reaction, but real justice, the kind that endures, comes from patience, discernment, and the deliberate choice to act with integrity even when the world expects chaos. And I want you to understand that accountability is not something that must be shouted to be effective. It is something that is measured, deliberate, and patient, and it does not require humiliation to create consequence, because the universe has a way of aligning itself around truth when left unforced, and this is where patience becomes a kind of quiet power, a tool stronger than anger, because patience allows you to see patterns that promises and words alone can never reveal, to notice the small inconsistencies that repeat over time, the subtle shifts in tone, timing, and behavior that tell the story beneath the story. And to those watching, it may look like waiting, like inactivity, but in truth, it is strategy, it is wisdom, it is the slow accumulation of knowledge that will protect you when the moment comes to act. And I cannot stress enough the importance of observing more than reacting, of documenting more than accusing, of remembering that self-respect is not borrowed from those around you, it is cultivated internally. And when you allow yourself to maintain dignity in the face of deceit, when you refuse to become frantic, reactive, or desperate, you create a position of power that no one can touch, because dignity is more resilient than betrayal, more enduring than lies, more persuasive than anger, and it is visible even when unspoken. It radiates in the way you carry yourself, the calmness in your voice, the steadiness of your gaze, and the composure of your presence, and the world notices even if people do not consciously acknowledge it. And more importantly, you notice, and that noticing is what sustains you, what separates those who survive deception and emerge whole from those who crumble in the chaos, because life will give you betrayal, it will give you lies, it will give you manipulation, but it also gives you the choice of how to respond, the ability to preserve your own integrity, to claim your own life back, to allow consequences to occur naturally without having to manufacture them, and in doing so, You see that patterns are far more important than promises, because words can be rehearsed, emotions can be faked, explanations can be manufactured, but patterns cannot lie. They repeat themselves consistently, quietly, persistently, and those repetitions, when observed, provide the clarity that prevents you from being blindsided, and I wish more people would. Understand that the world is rarely defined by single acts or dramatic moments, but by the steady rhythm of behavior over time, and that noticing that rhythm, understanding it, trusting your own perception, and acting deliberately in alignment with it is how you preserve yourself and your life. And this is where accountability meets patience, where observation becomes power, where silence holds more influence than confrontation ever could, and as you navigate relationships, marriages, friendships, and partnerships, remember that self-respect is non-negotiable, that integrity is not relative, that calmness is a force, and that walking away, when done correctly, when done with preparation and moral clarity, can speak louder than any accusation ever could, because it leaves you intact, unbroken, sovereign over your own story, and allows the universe to sort out what belongs and what doesn't. And in that act, in that deliberate decision to step away from chaos without joining it, you demonstrate to yourself and the world that betrayal may attempt to define you, deception may try to control your perception, and manipulation may twist narratives, but your dignity outlives it all, endures when falsehoods crumble, and resonates in ways that no lie, no performance, and no orchestrated deception can touch. And that is the lesson I leave you with: to listen to patterns and not promises, to value restraint over drama, to honor self-respect over vengeance, to act with deliberate calm in a world that expects emotional fireworks, and to trust that when you carry yourself with integrity, when you observe carefully, when you allow truth to speak quietly and fully, when you walk away without chaos, you claim something far greater than revenge. You claim freedom, you claim peace, and you demonstrate, above all else, that dignity outlives betrayal, that patience overcomes manipulation, and that a life governed by clarity, integrity, and thoughtful observation is one that no lie, no deceit, and no human failing can ever diminish, because it is anchored not in the temporary reactions of others but in the unshakable truth of who you are, how you choose to respond, and the calm, deliberate power of walking away clean while leaving the world to reconcile itself with the honesty you carried silently, steadily, unwaveringly. And that is the quiet, lasting, profound lesson I carry and the one I leave with you, that in the end, dignity, patience, and truth will always outlive the storms of betrayal.